I was the vicious supporting female character in the novel. Instead of inheriting the family's billion-dollar fortune, I stubbornly tried to ruin the relationship between the two tragic lovers. Later, the male lead used my family's wealth and influence to become the richest man in the city. But then he turned against us, ultimately destroying my family with nothing. Meanwhile, the main couple got their happy ending. One midnight, as I braved the rain to deliver a bowl of caring, stomach-nourishing porridge to the male lead, perhaps even heaven couldn't stand the idiotic plot the author forced on me. I tripped, fell, and I never thought I'd be grateful for cracking my skull open on a sidewalk. Rain pounded against my designer trench coat as I hurried through the darkness, carefully balancing a thermos of homemade stomach-soothing porridge. The streets of Manhattan glistened under the sparse streetlight, empty save for the occasional taxi splashing through puddles. "You're such an idiot," I muttered to myself, my heels clicking against the wet pavement. "He's probably with her right now, laughing at how pathetic you are." But I kept walking. Because that's what Victoria Reynolds did, chase after a man who saw her as nothing but a stepping stone. The real joke was that I didn't even need him. The Reynolds name carried weight across New York's financial district. Dad's technology empire was valued at over $10 billion. I was the sole heir. I had everything. Everything except Jason's love. My phone buzzed. A text from my father: "Victoria, we need to talk. The board meeting tomorrow is crucial. The Reed proposal is concerning." I ignored it. Dad was always worried about something. Lately, it had been Jason Reed, the charming startup founder I'd introduced to the family 3 years ago. Dad claimed Jason was only using me to get to Reynolds' tax resources. I should have listened. A crack of thunder, then my heel caught on something. The world tilted. The thermos flew from my hand as I pitched forward. There was a sickening crack as my head met the concrete. Pain, darkness, then clarity. Images flashed through my mind like a movie on fast forward. Jason standing beside Melissa, my childhood best friend, both of them laughing as Reynolds' tech stock plummeted. My father's heart attack after discovering Jason had stolen our proprietary technology. Our family's company dismantled piece by piece. Me, homeless, disgraced, watching from afar as Jason and Melissa celebrated their success with champagne in what used to be my father's office. The shame. The regret. The headlines: "Reynolds heiress loses everything to ex-boyfriend's business coup." Then darkness again. I guessed to wait, my body jerking upright. White walls. Beeping machines. Hospital. "Miss Reynolds." Thank goodness. A nurse hurried to my side. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. You had a nasty fall." My hands flew to my head, finding bandages wrapped tightly around it. "Your father's been here every day," she continued. "He just stepped out to take a call." "My father," I croaked. "He's okay?" She looked confused. "Of course. Why wouldn't he be?" I blinked, trying to organize my thoughts. Those visions. They felt so real. So detailed. Like memories of a future I hadn't lived yet. The door opened, and Dad walked in. Alive. Healthy. His face lined with worry rather than the devastation I'd seen in my vision, dream, premonition. "Victoria," he said, relief washing over his features as he rushed to my side. "You had us worried sick." "Dad," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I threw my arms around him, breathing in his familiar scent of expensive cologne and coffee. "I'm so sorry." He pulled back, studying my face. "For what, sweetheart?" "For not listening. For being so blind." I gripped his hand. "You were right about Jason, weren't you?" Dad's expression darkened. "That's not important right now. You need to rest." "Please, Dad. Tell me." He sighed, taking a seat on the edge of my bed. "The board and I have been investigating some inconsistencies. Files accessed at odd hours, meetings Jason's been having with competitors." He paused. "And there's something else. Your friend Melissa. She's been seeing him behind my back," I finished flatly. Dad's eyebrows shot up. "How did you know?" I stared at the ceiling, feeling an eerie calm settle over me. Let's just say I had an epiphany when my head hit the pavement. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty the visions weren't just nightmares. They were warnings. A preview of what would happen if I continued down this path. But now I had a second chance. "Dad," I said, my voice stronger, "we need to talk about the Reed proposal." He looked surprised. "You never showed interest in the business side before." "Things change." I managed a weak smile. Apparently, all it takes is a good knock to the head. As Dad filled me in on Jason's latest scheme proposal that would give his startup access to our core intellectual property, I felt something shift inside me. The love-sick, naive Victoria was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone clear-eyed, determined, and just a little bit vengeful. This time around, I wouldn't be the villain in my own story. I'd be the elf. And Jason Reed? He was about to learn that hell hath no fury like a Reynolds scorn. 1 week after my fall, I was back at Reynolds Tower, sitting in on my first executive board meeting. The expressions around the table ranged from surprise to suspicion as I took my seat beside my father. Said Howard Pierce, our CFO, "Oh, we weren't expecting you to join us. Especially after your accident." "I'm feeling much better, thank you, Howard." I smiled pleasantly. Almost like a new person, actually. Dad squeezed my hand under the table. We'd spent the past week strategizing. I'd shared everything I could remember from my visions, and we'd mapped out Jason's plan, how he would gradually gain access to our tech, dilute our patents, then use the Reed-Reynolds partnership to poach our top engineers before launching a hostile takeover. The doors opened, and Jason strode in, all perfect teeth and tailored suit. My stomach clenched at the sight of him. The man I'd once thought I loved. The man who in another timeline destroyed my family. His surprise seemed genuine as he approached, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "I had no idea you'd be here. How are you feeling, baby?" I allowed the kiss but didn't return it. He didn't catch my double meaning, simply nodding and taking his seat. "Well, I'm glad you'll be here for today's presentation. I think you'll be impressed." Jason launched into his pitch, the same one from my vision. A collaborative venture that would integrate Reed Innovations' AI platform with Reynolds Tech semiconductor technology. The perfect Trojan horse. I waited until he finished, watching the impressed nods around the table. In my previous life, I'd skipped this meeting to go shopping. Now, I could see exactly how Jason had charmed his way into our company's heart. "That was fascinating, Jason," I said when he concluded. "I just have a few questions." Jason beamed at me, clearly expecting softball questions from his supportive girlfriend. "Of course, Victoria. Ask away. Could you explain how your AI implementation differs from the one our R&D team has been developing for the past 18 months? His smile faltered slightly. "I wasn't aware Reynolds had an internal AI project. We don't advertise it," I said sweetly. "Just like you don't advertise that 3 of your core developers previously worked for Meridian Systems and are still bound by non-compete clauses that would make this partnership legally problematic." The room went silent. Jason stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Also," I continued, pulling out a folder, "I'd love for you to explain these." I slid the papers across the table, records of meetings between Jason and our competitors, obtained through Dad's private investigation. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding," Jason said, his voice tight. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "Oh, I think the board deserves to hear your explanation." I tapped the folder. "Especially about your dinner with Chen Yu from East Tech last Tuesday. The same night you told me you were working late." Jason's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. I meet with lots of industry people." At the Waldorf Astoria, in a private dining room, I pulled out my phone and played a recording Jason discussing how he planned to extract what we need from Reynolds before moving on. Dad hadn't known about this evidence. His sharp intake of breath told me I'd gone beyond our strategy, but I couldn't stop now. "And then there's your personal relationship with Melissa Carter." I kept my voice steady despite the "My oldest friend. Who you've been seeing for, 6 months now?" Jason's professional mascot. Did Melissa? His own words condemned him. Murmurs erupted around the table. "Mr. Reed," my father said, standing. "I think this meeting is over. Security will escort you out." As 2 guards appeared at the door, Jason's charming facade dissolved completely. "You frigid bitch," he hissed at me. "You're making a huge mistake. I was your only chance at being something more than Addie's spoiled princess." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "No, Jason. You were my mistake. One I won't make again." After he was removed, Dad called for a short recess. When we were alone, he turned to me with wide eyes. "That recording, how did you get it?" I hesitated. I couldn't exactly tell him that in my vision future. I'd found this evidence too late, after Jason had already done irreparable damage. Let's just say I had my suspicions for a while and hired someone to follow him. The lie came easily. I wanted to be sure before I broke things off. Dad studied me for a long moment. You've changed. For the better, I hope. I nodded slowly. Definitely for the better. But what? I just hope you don't let this harden you completely. Jason was a snake, but not everyone is. I thought about the cold, calculating woman I'd become in my vision, obsessed with revenge even as my world crumbled. That wasn't who I wanted to be either. I won't, Dad. I promise. But as I said it, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. WTF Victoria, Jason just called me, freaking out. What did you do? I stared at the message from the woman who, in another life, had stood smiling beside Jason as they watched my family's legacy burn to the ground. Some betrayals shouldn't be forgiven. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of transformation. I threw myself into learning every aspect of Reynolds Tech, absorbing financial reports, engineering specs, and market analyses like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. Gone were the days of tour lunches and impulse shopping sprees. The new Victoria arrived at the office before dawn and left after sunset, earning first curious glances, then reluctant respect from employees who had previously seen me as nothing but the boss's spoiled daughter. Jason, meanwhile, hadn't gone quietly. Within weeks of his ejection from Reynolds Tower, tech blogs began publishing thinly veiled hit pieces about Reynolds Tech's outdated leadership and resistance to innovation. The source wasn't hard to guess. Then came the talent poaching. Despite having his partnership rejected, Jason still managed to lure away several key engineers from our AI division. Each departure felt like a personal betrayal, especially since I knew exactly what he planned to do with their expertise. Most painful was Melissa's complete radio silence after our confrontation. I'd met her for coffee, laid out everything I knew about her affair with Jason, and watched as her denials crumbled into tearful confessions. He said you two were practically over, she'd claimed. That you were only together for appearances. And you believed him? I'd asked, my voice hollow. After 20 years of friendship? She had no answer for that. Now, sitting in my new office on the executive floor, I reviewed the latest financial reports with growing concern. Reed Innovations had secured a massive round of funding, $200 million from a consortium led by EastTech, our biggest competitor in the Asian market. He's moving faster this time, I murmured. What was that? Asked Samantha, my newly hired assistant. Nothing. I closed the report. Is the team ready for our meeting? Ma'am, an audit. Everyone's in the conference room. I smoothed down my blazer and made my way there, where a dozen expectant faces turned toward me. Most belonged to Reynolds' veterans, experienced engineers and business strategists. But mixed among them were several newer faces, young talents I'd personally recruited from top universities and competing firms. Thank you all for coming, I began. As you know, Reed Innovations has made their intentions clear with their latest funding round. They're positioning to compete directly with our core products, using our own forward talent against us. Nods around the table. This wasn't news. What you don't know is that we've been preparing our response for months. I pulled up a presentation. Project Phoenix. For the next hour, I outlined my vision. A complete re-imaging of Reynolds Tech's semiconductor architecture, optimized specifically for AI applications. It was technically ambitious, probably impossible on the timeline I was proposing, but it targeted the exact market Jason was aiming for and bleeped fraud. This approach, Ms. Reynolds, said Drive Parker, our head of research, this is, well, revolutionary if it works. But the resource requirements are already budgeted. I finished for him. My father and the board have approved a dedicated facility and team. We break ground next month. The room buzzed with excitement mingled with skepticism. One more thing, I said, silencing the chatter. This project remains completely confidential. No social media, no discussions outside this room, not even with other Reynolds employees. After what happened with Reed, we can't risk another leak. As the team filed out, energized by the challenge, Dad lingered behind. That was impressive, he said. Though I noticed you didn't mention the regulatory component of your plan. I smiled. One battle at a time. Let the team focus on the technology first. The regulatory component was perhaps the most audacious part of my strategy. Through careful review of Jason's previous ventures, I discovered a pattern of cutting corners on data security and privacy vulnerabilities that hadn't mattered for his smaller projects but would become critical with the scale he now pursued. I'd already been in quiet discussions with contacts at the Federal Trade Commission, ostensibly to ensure Reynolds' new projects would be compliant with upcoming regulatory changes. But those same conversations had directed attention toward industry practices that, coincidentally, aligned perfectly with Reed Innovations' methods. The trap was set. All we needed was for Jason to step into it. That evening, as I was preparing to finally leave the office, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Victoria Reynolds," I answered. "You've made quite the impression these past few months." The voice sent a chill down my spine. "Jason, what do you want?" I kept my tone neutral despite the hammering of my heart. "To congratulate you, actually. The board seat, the new RD initiative. You've been busy. If you're calling to intimidate me, you're wasting your time." He laughed, the sound as charming as ever. How had I not heard the emptiness behind it before? "Actually, I'm calling to propose a truce. This rivalry is becoming expensive for both of us. Perhaps we should discuss a more collaborative approach. Like your last collaboration proposal?" "No, thank you." His voice softened. "I know I hurt you. That was never my intention. We were good together once. Maybe we still could be personally, unprofessionally. In my previous life, I might have melted at those words, desperate to believe him. Now, they only reinforced my resolve." "You're calling because your investors are getting nervous," I said flatly. "Our Project Phoenix announcement leaked, and suddenly your revolutionary approach doesn't seem so revolutionary anymore." Silence confirmed my guess. "Here's my counteroffer, Jason. Stay away from Reynolds Tech, stay away from me, and I'll stay away from the skeletons in your corporate closet." "Threats now? That's not like you, Victoria. You have no idea what I'm like." "Not anymore." I ended the call. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From excitement. Jason was rattled, something my vision had told me would be nearly impossible. I was changing the future, one move at a time. 6 months into Project Phoenix, Reynolds Tech had transformed. The sleepy family company had become a buzzing hive of innovation, attracting talent and media attention in equal measure. Our stock had climbed 20% on anticipation of our new architecture. I was in the prototype lab, reviewing test results with our engineering team, when Samantha rushed in. "Ms. Reynolds, you need to see this." She thrust her tablet toward me. The screen displayed a press release. Reed Innovations announces breakthrough AI platform, files patent for quantum-enhanced neural network. My blood ran cold. This was exactly how it had happened in my vision. Jason filing patents that incorporated stolen Reynolds Tech research, effectively blocking us from using our own innovations. "When was this filed?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. 3 days ago," Samantha replied. "But that's not all. Look at the technical specs." I scrolled through the document, my alarm growing. The approach was eerily similar to Project Phoenix, too similar to be coincidence. "We have a leak," I said grimly. "Get me the access logs for our secure server. And call my father in legal." Within the hour, our security team had identified the breach. Someone had used Drive Parker's credentials to access our most sensitive files last week while he was presenting at a conference in Berlin. "It wasn't me," the research director insisted when confronted, his face pale. "I never gave anyone my login." I believed him. "Was your laptop ever out of your sight during the conference?" He hesitated. "There was a reception. I might have left it in my room for a few hours." "An attendant? Not in the hotel safe?" Dr. Parker looked down. "I thought the room was secure." Classic Jason. He wouldn't get his hands dirty with actual hacking, but he'd have no qualms about hiring someone to access an unattended laptop. Our legal team advised immediate action. By evening, we'd filed challenges to Reed's patents and preliminary injunctions to prevent them from using the technology, pending investigation. The tech press exploded with the brewing war between Reynolds and Reed. Our stock dipped as investors worried about protracted legal battles. "It's exactly what he wants," I told Dad in his office that night. "Tie us up in litigation to slow our progress while he pushes forward." Dad looked exhausted. "The board is concerned. Some are suggesting we should negotiate rather than fight." "That's what happened before," I said, without thinking. Before what? I caught myself. Before. In similar cases I studied. The bigger company gives in to avoid the hassle, and the upstart wins by default. Dad studied me with that same curious expression he'd worn ever since my accident. Sometimes I felt he suspected there was more to my transformation than I'd admitted. What do you suggest instead? He asked. We fight on multiple fronts. Legal, yes, but we also accelerate Phoenix. And I hesitated, then committed. We take the battle public. The next morning, I sat for my first ever television interview with TechCrunch's streaming news program. The young interviewer clearly expected corporate platitudes about ongoing legal matters. Instead, I came armed with documents. Reynolds Tech has been developing this architecture for over a year, I explained, displaying data-designed documents carefully redacted to protect our actual trade secrets. We can prove it. The question is how Reed Innovations developed a nearly identical approach in a fraction of the time, immediately after hiring former Reynolds engineers. Are you directly accusing Jason Reed of corporate espionage? The interviewer asked, eyes wide. I smiled, coolly. I'm simply pointing out the timeline and asking the industry to draw its own conclusions. And I'm stating publicly that Reynolds Tech will not be bullied or stolen from by Reed Innovations or anyone else. As expected, Jason sued for defamation within hours. Also as expected, the lawsuit only drew more attention to the similarities between our technologies and the suspicious timing. What I hadn't anticipated was Melissa reaching out. We need to talk. It's important. Her text came late that night as I was finally heading home. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a quiet bar downtown. She was already there when I arrived, nursing a glass of wine and looking as though she hadn't slept in days. Thank you for coming, she said as I slid into the booth across from her. Make it quick, Melissa. I have an early morning. She took a deep breath. I'd been working with Jason. This wasn't new. I know. As his girlfriend and apparently his corporate spy. She flinched. It's more complicated than that. After you confronted me, things changed. Jason became obsessive about Reynolds Tech, about beating you specifically. It wasn't about business anymore, it was personal. And you stayed with him anyway. I stayed because I was scared of what he might do, she shot back. And because I thought I could mitigate some of the damage. I raised an eyebrow. Mitigate? By helping him steal our research? By feeding him partial information, she countered. Do you think it's coincidence that the stolen designs have fundamental flaws that won't be apparent until full implementation? That got my attention. What are you talking about? She pulled out a flash drive. The Phoenix specs Jason has, they'll work on small scales, but fail catastrophically with larger datasets. I made sure of it. I stared at her, trying to process this. Why would you do that? Because you were right. About everything. Her eyes filled with tears. 2 decades of friendship and I threw it away for a man who sees people as tools. I can't undo what I did, but I can help you stop him. The flash drive sat between us like a live grenade. What's on this? I asked. Everything. Internal Reed communications planning the corporate espionage. Technical documentation of how they modified your stolen research. And evidence that Jason has been deliberately violating data privacy regulations with their existing products. The regulatory trap I'd been laying, Melissa was offering to spring it immediately. Why should I trust you now? I asked. She met my eyes steadily. You shouldn't. Trust the evidence. Verify everything. But use it, Victoria. Before he does to someone else what he tried to do to you. I took the drive, but not her offered hand. This doesn't fix things between us, I said quietly. I know. She stood to leave. Just promise me one thing. When you take him down, and you will make sure it sticks. Jason Reed doesn't lose gracefully. As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but not from my accident vision. This moment a betrayer turned ally, a crucial piece of evidence felt like part of a story I'd read long ago. A turning point. In my hand, I held the power to destroy Jason Reed completely. But as I remembered my father's warning about not letting this experience harden me, I wondered, what kind of victory did I really want? The Reynolds Tech legal team worked through the night verifying Melissa's evidence. By morning, we had confirmation everything was authentic. This is explosive, our lead counsel said, dark circles under his eyes from the all-nighter. The FTC violations alone could trigger millions in fines. The corporate espionage evidence is enough for criminal charges. I sat at the head of the conference table, turning it over in my mind. This was more than I'd hoped for, a complete victory handed to me, on a silver platter. So why did it feel hollow? Dad prompted. What do you want to do with this? In my vision, Jason had destroyed us without mercy. The Victoria who'd crashed on that rainy night would have released everything immediately, reveling in his downfall. But I wasn't her anymore. We hold the FTC evidence for now, I decided. Use the corporate espionage documentation to force settlement of the patent dispute. I want full ownership of the technology, a public apology, and his resignation from Reed Innovations. Dad looked surprised. You're offering him a way out? I'm offering his investors a way to salvage their company, I corrected. Without Jason at the helm. The negotiations were brief and one-sided. Faced with irrefutable evidence and potential criminal charges, Reed's board members quickly sided against Jason. The settlement was announced the following week. Reed Innovations acknowledged improper acquisition of Reynolds' intellectual property, transferred all related patents to us and announced Jason's resignation to pursue other opportunity. The tech press hailed it as a resounding victory for Reynolds. Our stock soared. Project Phoenix proceeded without further interference, now bolstered by the incorporation of a few genuinely innovative elements from Reed's implementation. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt unsettled. This resolution was too clean, too easy. The Jason I knew both from my relationship and my vision would surrender so quietly. I was right to be concerned. 3 days after the settlement, I received a private message on my personal email linked to an encrypted file with a simple note. You should see this before it goes public. The sender, Melissa again. The file contained recordings of Jason, clearly made secretly, raging about his plans for revenge. Not just against Reynolds' stack but against me personally. Detailed, disturbing plans that went far beyond business competition into the realm of obsession. I'll destroy everything she loves. His voice seethed in one recording. Her company, her reputation, her family. She thinks she's won. I'm just getting started. More disturbing were the documents showing he'd already begun preparations for a dedicated smear campaign targeting not just me but my father, including fabricated evidence of financial improprieties that could trigger SEC investigations. My hands shook as I closed the file. This was what I'd feared Jason, and bound by professional constraints, driven purely by vindictive rage. I called, Melissa. How did you get these? I demanded when she answered. I've been recording our conversations for months as insurance, she replied, her voice tight. After your victory hit the news, he changed. Became someone I didn't recognize. I found the fabricated documents on his laptop last night. And he doesn't know you have them. No, I left. I'm staying with my sister in Boston. She paused. What are you going to do? A good question. The settlement protected Reynolds' tech, but it had clearly pushed Jason over an edge. He had nothing to lose now, which made him more dangerous than ever. I'll handle it, I said finally. I spent that night reviewing everything, the evidence from Melissa, the FTC violations we'd held back, and files from my own investigation. By morning, I had my plan. I called a private meeting with just my father and our most trusted legal advisor. Jason's planning to attack us personally, I explained, showing them the evidence. But I think I've found a way to neutralize the threat permanently. My plan was simple but effective. Rather than directly retaliating, we would establish a protective structure around ourselves and Reynolds' tech. The FTC evidence would be placed in escrow with instructions for release if any attack on Reynolds occurred. We'd quietly brief Keefe and Anshel journalists on the fabricated nature of Jason's evidence before he could release it, immunizing us against his smear campaign. Most importantly, we would establish a foundation funded by Reynolds Tech but operated independently, focused on ethical technology development, corporate accountability. The message would be clear: any attack on us would not only fail but would strengthen the very values Jason sought to undermine. It's defensive rather than punitive, Dad noted, studying the plan. Yes, I agreed. The best victory isn't destroying your enemy. It's creating a situation where they can't hurt you anymore, where attacking you would only hurt themselves. Dad smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. When did you get so wise? When I hit my head and saw what could happen if I didn't change, I answered honestly. We implemented the plan quietly over the next few weeks. As expected, Jason made his move, leaking his fabricated evidence to several financial outlets. But the pre-briefed journalists recognized the deception immediately. Instead of the scandal he'd hoped for, the story became about his desperate attempt at revenge. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. With Jason's reputation in tatters and Reed Innovations struggling to recover, East Tech, his primary backer, publicly distanced themselves. In their statement, they specifically cited the Reynolds Foundation for Ethical Technology as an initiative they wished to align with moving forward. The message was clear: Jason Reed was toxic, and the industry had moved on. 6 months later, Project Phoenix launched to universal acclaim. The new architecture performed beyond even our optimistic projections, establishing Reynolds Tech as the leader in AI-optimized semiconductor technology. I stood at the podium during the launch event, looking out at the assembled tech press and industry luminaries. My father sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Technology is just a tool, I concluded my speech. What matters is how we use it, and the values we embed within it. At Reynolds, we're committed to developing technology that lifts people up rather than exploits them. That builds rather than destroys. As the applause washed over me, I caught sight of a familiar face at the back of the room. Melissa, watching quietly. When our eyes met, she gave a small nod before slipping out. We weren't friends again, perhaps never would be. But there was a mutual respect now, an acknowledgement of lessons learned the hard way. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Dad joined me on the balcony overlooking the city. "You've done something remarkable," he said, sipping his champagne. "Not just with Phoenix, but with yourself." I smiled, watching the lights of Manhattan glitter below us. Sometimes it takes a catastrophe to show us who we really are. Or, who we could be, Dad added. I thought about that night in the rain, the fall that had changed everything. Had it really been a vision of the future? A parallel universe, or simply my subconscious connecting dots I'd refused to see? It didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd been given a second chance, and I'd used it not just to save my family's legacy, but to become someone I could be proud of. Somewhere out there, Jason Reed was plotting his next move, nursing his wounds and his hatred. But that was his story now, not mine. I'd escaped the role of villain in my own life. My story was just beginning.